the wonderful Susan Joyce, who is going to talk to us about the wonderful world of human rights. Now, Susan, if I've got this right, I'm going to be sharing your slides for you. Is that correct?
Yes, thanks. I'd appreciate that. We have some challenges on internet connectivity in rural British Columbia. Thanks, Sarah. So before, just as an opening, I want to say that Andy's presentation couldn't have been more perfect a segue into what I want to talk about. If you think about the graph that he put up about all that early decision-making process and the optionality early on, you know, one of the main points that I want to make about changing the decision framework for in terms of how we look at social and environmental ecosystem impacts and switching that lens to a human right lens is exactly what Andy's arguing for. That, and my point would be that early on, when you can factor in some of these critical questions about how the rights of people may be affected by the project at all, and also by the different options, the different alternatives that you have for how it's developed. If that doesn't happen early on, prior to, you know, when those optionalities are being evaluated and when the decisions are not yet made, by the time, for example, that we get to an EIA process, which is much later in the evolution of the decision-making process, and more importantly, the investment curve for miners. So much money has been invested behind a project. There is so much momentum and need to move ahead with projects if they look good economically, that it's very, very hard at that point in time to say no, to say it's a no-go in terms of social or human rights issues, cultural values. So what I'm proposing in terms of trying to break a little bit from the EIA and environmental regulatory process as sort of the key point in time when we look at potential impacts is pulling that process forward, perfectly aligned with what Andy just presented. So take the first slide, Sarah, thanks.
Oh.
There we go. And human rights is brought into the picture in a context where even the conflict is still very common within extractive industries, in particular mining. This picture is from the Bagua conflict in Peru quite a few years ago now. And that even though the Sustainable Development Goals and other initiatives like social impact investing are quite visible, they're quite hot trends right now. In particular, many companies are bringing on board the Sustainable Development Goals. They can't be, you have to remember that the underbelly or the underpinning of that has to be an adequate understanding of the potential risks and impacts. It's not enough to provide benefits to try to fulfill Sustainable Development Goals if the impact side and the people who are actually experiencing the impacts, if that's not addressed. Investors are a really important part of this scenario. They're part of what is driving the attention to human rights and its increasing uptake. And I'll talk about that a little bit further, the power of the investor community in this. Next slide. So a brief introduction to the Business and Human Rights Framework. In 2011, the UN Human Rights Commission endorsed the guiding principles on business and human rights, which have 3 pillars, and established the difference in roles and responsibilities, most importantly between the state and the private sector. So it really helped to frame out for the private sector what it needs to do. So there's the pillar of protection by the state, and the new pillar, which was identified from that point going forward, which is the responsibility of the private sector to respect human rights. And third, both the state and the private sector have a role in establishing the remedy sector and ensuring that victims have access to effective remedy. And we'll talk about that a bit. I was trying to advance my slides. Can you give me the next one, please? So the fundamentals of bringing human rights into private sector responsibility, and in particular in the extractives, is this model of due diligence with respect to human rights. And one of the points that I wanted to make, in particular with reference to a number of the previous presentations, is what human rights does more than any other framework is it puts preventing harm to people right at the center of the decision-making process and the data gathering. But not only does it do that, it prioritizes the voice of the people who are potentially affected, and ensures that when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about benefits, we're not talking about our idea as miners of what will benefit them in the long term, or even the government's idea of what benefits or modernization should look like for them. What we're talking about is bringing the process home, and from the beginning understanding the values and the visions that local people whose rights are at risk have of what they want their future to look like. And mining may not be compatible with that. And we know a number of cases where people have said it's incompatible with how they see their future. But responsible mining, responsible raw material development may be very, very consistent with the vision and the values base of others. So it's critical that human rights also changes the lens in terms of whose values need to be looked at. Next slide. The human rights framework, since it was introduced in 2011, has had extraordinary support and endorsement from industry associations, from international agencies, and I think really importantly, and I want to point this out, from the increasingly growing community of responsible investors. If you'll notice, the PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, based on their website and information that I've been able to find, that organization today represents investors who have more than probably close to $80 trillion under their control. I was recently involved on the expert panel for the Global Tailings Review, which developed is developing a global tailings standard. And the role of the investment community in that was very, very powerful. So it's an important driver in this process in terms of the increasing uptake and attention to human rights. Sarah, next slide. So just a couple of the key points from John Ruggie, who developed the UN Guiding Principles, and that is that it's, I think the most important one is that it's not enough in some cases to be passive and to say that we're not doing any harm. There are contexts in which where a company is present, where its activities are interacting with and changing, affecting background conditions. The companies may need to do more than ensure they're not actively doing harm. They may need to actively work on their interaction with the context if the context is causing harm. But in general, the overall framework is very well developed and was done with a lot of broad consultation. Next point, Sarah. So I think it's something that the industry in general has not understood, and most people who haven't worked in human rights don't understand that human rights is very much of an evolving framework. Not only this shows the timeline of some of the key legislative and international standards, but our understanding of what are human rights is also evolving. There's an emerging clarity around environmental rights, for example, and water standing on its own in terms of an environmental right. And what we look at here, as we've moved from voluntary principles and voluntary standards, even the UN guiding principles are voluntary, what we're seeing is an evolution toward hard law, which is actual development of regulatory frameworks. Next slide, Sarah. So looking concretely at what that tension is and what does human rights bring to it, just to go through a couple of examples, the human rights lens is a much broader, a much deeper lens than, say, even environmental and social impact assessment, even in the context of, say, the IFC performance standards, which are the most important framework out there. This slide looks at a number of ways in which bringing a human rights lens and bringing that lens much earlier in the project. And I would say pre-feasibility, when the first boots go on the ground, Sarah knows I'm an advocate of this kind of look at the human rights context at the time that exploration and prospecting has taken place, so that you know what you're looking at and there's no surprises for the mining company either. But these are ways in which the human rights lens requires a broader look and beyond what the regulatory framework of an EIA process can give you. So without going into detail, hopefully you'll all get a chance to see this if you want to follow up. Next slide. So from managing impacts, which is the way the impact of a project is done, to respecting rights, we're talking about really bringing the time frame forward, and we're talking about understanding and giving the ability of people in a place to articulate and define what are the values to them and what needs to be protected in the environment, what needs to be in place for them to continue to operate. This is an example of some high-level thoughts about balancing rights with the decision to make a mine, and what would shift in the way we make decisions and how we prioritize things if human rights are really being taken into consideration. A good example here is collective and prior agreement, for example, on the conditions of water use by a mine, and how that water use or the investment in water resources can actually contribute to improving water resources for the region as a whole. But understanding that use and access to water is a much broader and more complex issue than what the government issuing of permits may be, and that the needs of the local people and their reliance on the local ecosystems has to be fundamentally part of that decision-making process. And again, earlier, as per Andy's graph. So that, next slide. That's my presentation. Actually, you can leave this one up. I've lost the screen, so I assume that we're done, but that's it for the presentation. I hope I've made some of these points, brought them to life a little bit for you.
Absolutely fantastic, brilliant. Thank you very much, Susan. So yes, you can imagine that round of applause going on in your mind. And as the questions come in for you, so you can see that again we've switched gears. We're now looking at perhaps one of the most complex areas that we need to be considering when we're talking about those natural resources around the human rights aspect. And a question just to get us going, Susan, and you were beginning to touch on it towards the end. Where do you see this, I guess, this tension in human rights between where there might be an opportunity to make a change to something in someone's frame of reference? So say, for example, there's the opportunity to extract copper out of the ground within an area in which someone lives, and through that you actually might make the availability of water slightly less variable because you're actually putting in the infrastructure. So you've got the opportunity for change, I guess, versus people not wanting to disturb a way of life that is occurring within that particular environment. How do you begin to get to grips with that and begin to balance that up before you even go into an area to undertake any real work to see if there's really anything there from a raw materials perspective?
That's an easy question, Sarah. That's a tough one, and I think a lot of it, at least my experience working in a number of countries in Latin America, suggests that what underpins a lot of the, not all obviously, but what underpins some of the opposition and fear associated with raw material extraction, with mining in particular, is the legacy of environmental and health damage that historical mining has done. And it's a question of being able to, if you're a responsible operator, how do you build a basis of confidence much earlier in the process so that people can begin to understand that mineral development in this particular context, in this particular day and age, is going to involve a different flow of opportunities for local people. It's going to involve long-term responsibility, like the other speakers have talked about. But building a framework in which local needs and issues are going to be seriously considered and taken on board, and not subjugated or subordinated to what's generally perceived as private sector gain at the expense of local people, and government priorities for resource development. And the human rights lens, speaking from the perspective of the mining company, provides mechanisms for understanding where the tensions are going to be early on, and it allows, if it's fully integrated and part of the decision-making framework, it gives investors some confidence that the project itself is not going to be, the project itself and the state, who is often very much at fault in terms of promoting extractive economic models, that these are not going to be bulldozing the rights of local people, local communities, local landowners in exchange for establishing an extractive project on site. So it's extremely complex, and it's different in every country, but it's got to start from building a confidence base that responsible mining is not going to operate the way traditional mining did. And I find, where I have worked, that the human rights framework, the human rights lens, changes the consideration so significantly that people do develop trust, even in very low trust contexts. People do begin, when it's fully followed through on, they begin to see a different possible path forward.
So you mentioned the word trust there, Susan, which I think is so critical with regards to this aspect. And again, this is not a very good segue, but Aldo's just asked a great question, which is there a gap or tension between what governments require for permitting and human rights expectations placed by stakeholders on companies? What do you think with regards to that?
It's enormous, and that's the gist of the shift from managing impacts to respecting rights, is to say that coming in with a project that has a premise of having negative impacts on people and managing them, and that the trade-off has to be to sort of buy sufficient support by putting enough money into projects. If you're going to respect rights, you have to begin talking to people early on. And that's why I think the regulatory framework is so limiting, because so many companies only think of, it's crazy. We know early engagement is important, but having substantive discussions about what a mine might look like and how the post-mining environment is going to ensure, for example, the sustainability of their lives and their values, their culture, looking at the full life cycle of the mine from beginning to end, which is a way of demonstrating respect for rights by recognizing that they will be there when you close and you will be gone. So the legal regulatory requirements are extremely limited, and they're also, they're in many cases far below the bar of the international standards, which to some degree have incorporated human rights questions and concerns, but again, without necessarily being able to pull them to that early phase where those key questions need to be asked and go into the decision-making model that Andy was talking about.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Susan. We're going to have to stop you there. I could keep asking you questions all day, but again, round of applause for Susan. Thank you very, very much. That was fantastic.